You can't be serious. There has to be some mistake in the paperwork. Margaret Brooks stared at the legal documents spread across the mahogany table, her manicured fingers trembling as she flipped through page after page of property deeds, trust agreements, and ownership transfers. The same woman who had spent 3 years calling Elara, that pathetic little gold digger, now faced the impossible truth that would reshape everything she thought she knew about power, family, and the quiet widow she had dismissed. The auction house had fallen silent. Every bidder, every spectator, every member of the Brooks family who had gathered to watch the estate they considered theirs by birthright get sold to the highest bidder, now stared at the elegantly dressed woman standing calmly at the back of the room. Elara Brooks hadn't come to bid on her former home. She had come to reclaim what was already hers. You know, there's something beautiful about karma when it arrives dressed in designer clothes and carrying ironclad legal proof. Sometimes justice doesn't crash through your life like a hurricane. Sometimes it walks through the front door with the quiet confidence of someone who has spent years planning the perfect moment to reveal the truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person everyone underestimated turns out to hold all the cards. How are you all doing today? I hope wherever you're watching this from, you're somewhere comfortable, because this story is going to take you on a journey that proves why you should never, ever underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. Whether you're dealing with difficult family members, workplace bullies, or anyone who has ever made you feel small, this story will remind you that strength isn't always loud, and revenge isn't always immediate. This is the story of Elara Brooks, a woman who went from being dismissed as the poor widow on the hill, to revealing herself as the rightful owner of one of the most prestigious estates in Crestwood. But more than that, this is the story of how love can transcend death, how trust can be both a weakness and a weapon, and how sometimes the greatest gift someone can leave you isn't money or property, but the chance to discover exactly how strong you really are. Before we dive into how Elara orchestrated one of the most elegant takedowns in family history, let me ask you to hit that like button if you enjoy stories about underdogs who refuse to stay down, and don't forget to subscribe because we've got more incredible tales of justice, transformation, and people who refuse to let others define their worth. But let me start from the beginning, because Elara's story doesn't begin with triumph. It begins with a young woman who believed that love and loyalty were enough to protect her from the wolves disguised as family. 3 years earlier, Elara had been a completely different person. At 26, she possessed the kind of trusting nature that made her dangerous to her own interests. She believed that when people said they loved Daniel, they also cared about his happiness. She believed that marriage meant joining a family, not walking into a battlefield. She believed that grief would bring people together, not tear them apart in a feeding frenzy of greed and entitlement. Daniel Brooks had been her everything. Not because he was wealthy, though the Brooks family fortune was substantial, but because he saw her exactly as she was and loved her without reservation. They had met at a charity gala where she was working as an event coordinator, and he had spent the entire evening asking her questions about herself instead of talking about his family's business empire or the estate that had been in the Brooks family for 4 generations. Their courtship had been a fairy tale, complete with romantic dinners, weekend trips to the coast, and long conversations about building a life together. Daniel had been different from his family in every way that mattered. Where they were calculating, he was generous. Where they were suspicious of outsiders, he was welcoming. Where they measured people by their bank accounts and pedigrees, he valued kindness and authenticity. The wedding had been magnificent. Margaret Brooks, Daniel's mother, had insisted on planning every detail, and Elara had been grateful for the help. She thought it meant acceptance. She thought it meant she was truly becoming part of the family. The ceremony took place on the estate grounds, with 300 guests dining under crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom, toasting the happy couple with champagne that cost more than most people's monthly salary. But there had been signs, small moments that Elara would later recognize as warnings she should have heeded. The way Margaret always included little comments about Elara's background when introducing her to family friends. The way Daniel's brother James would smile when discussing prenuptial agreements, as if he knew something she didn't. The way the family lawyer had insisted on explaining certain clauses in the marriage documents with just a bit too much emphasis on what would happen, in the unlikely event of Daniel's death. Elara had dismissed these moments because she was in love, and love has a way of making us blind to the very things we most need to see. What none of them knew, what Elara herself wouldn't discover until years later, was that Daniel had seen everything. Every dismissive comment, every calculating look, every moment when his family treated his wife like a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent member of their circle. And in response to what he witnessed, Daniel had begun making plans that would only activate when Elara needed them most. The first clue had been hidden in plain sight all along, in a safety deposit box key that Daniel had given her during their first anniversary dinner, telling her it contained something for our future. Elara had assumed it held important documents or perhaps jewelry meant for special occasions. She had no idea it contained the key to an empire that would soon be hers to command. The first 2 years of marriage had felt like living in a beautiful dream that occasionally turned into a subtle nightmare. Elara had moved into the Brooks estate, a sprawling property that had been in the family since 1892, complete with vineyards, guest houses, and enough rooms to house a small hotel. The main house alone had 12 bedrooms, each decorated with antiques that cost more than most people's cars. Daniel had tried to make her feel at home, but home was a complicated concept when you were sharing space with people who measured your worth by your family tree. Margaret Brooks had a particular talent for making comments that sounded supportive on the surface but carried deeper messages about Elara's place in the hierarchy. "Oh Elara, that dress is lovely. Very appropriate for someone in your position," Margaret would say at family dinners, always emphasizing those last few words just enough to remind everyone present that Elara's position was tenuous at best. James Brooks, Daniel's older brother, had inherited their father's business instincts along with his suspicion of anyone who hadn't grown up with trust funds and boarding school connections. He worked as the family's primary business manager, overseeing investments and property management with the cold efficiency of someone who viewed relationships as transactions. James had never said anything directly insulting to Elara, but he had a way of discussing family finances and future plans as if she weren't sitting right there at the dinner table. "Daniel, we need to discuss the estate planning updates," James would say, glancing meaningfully at his mother. "Perhaps we should schedule a time when we can speak privately about the family assets." Daniel would always respond the same way. "Elara is my wife, James. She's family now. Whatever concerns our future concerns her too." But Elara had learned to recognize the look that passed between James and Margaret during these exchanges. It was the look of people who were simply waiting for the right moment to correct what they saw as a temporary problem. The most painful part wasn't the obvious disapproval. It was the way they made her question her own perceptions. When Margaret would make cutting remarks about Elara's background and then act shocked if Elara seemed hurt, insisting she was just being practical about family compatibility. When James would exclude her from business discussions and then claim he was protecting her from boring details. When Daniel's Aunt Patricia would ask pointed questions about Elara's career ambitions, as if wanting to work was somehow evidence of gold-digging behavior. Daniel saw more than Elara realized. While she was trying to win over his family by being the perfect daughter-in-law, attending every social function and learning the intricate rules of their social circle, Daniel was quietly documenting their behavior. He kept a private journal where he recorded conversations that revealed his family's true feelings about his marriage. He saved voicemails from James discussing the Elara situation, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. Most importantly, Daniel began meeting secretly with estate attorneys who specialized in asset protection and trust management. He told them he wanted to ensure his wife would be financially secure no matter what happened, but he also wanted to protect her from family members who might try to contest his wishes after his death. The attorneys helped Daniel create a complex web of legal structures that would be nearly impossible to challenge. He established multiple trusts with Alara as the primary beneficiary, but he structured them in ways that wouldn't become apparent until specific conditions were met. Some assets were held in corporations where Alara was listed as a silent partner. Others were transferred into educational foundations where she served as the designated successor. Daniel's masterpiece was the estate itself. On paper, it appeared that the property was held in a family trust managed by James, with various family members listed as beneficiaries. But buried deep in the legal documentation was a clause that transferred full ownership to Alara in the event of Daniel's death, provided she could produce specific documentation that only she possessed. The safety deposit box key was just the beginning. Daniel also gave Alara what appeared to be family heirlooms, items she treasured because of their sentimental value. What she didn't know was that several of these pieces contained hidden compartments with additional keys, account numbers, and legal documents that would eventually prove her ownership of assets the family believed belonged to them. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October when Daniel collapsed during his morning run. The doctors initially thought it was exhaustion from work stress, but tests revealed a rare form of cancer that was already in advanced stages. The diagnosis came with a timeline that felt impossibly short, 6 months, possibly 8 if the treatment went well. The family's reaction to Daniel's illness revealed everything Alara needed to know about their true priorities. Within days of the diagnosis, James had scheduled meetings with estate attorneys to discuss protecting family assets during this difficult time. Margaret began making suggestions about medical decisions that would preserve Daniel's quality of life, while also minimizing the financial impact of expensive treatments. Most telling was their attitude toward Alara herself. Suddenly, the woman they had barely tolerated became the subject of intense interest. Margaret started inviting her to private lunches where she would casually mention how difficult it must be for someone so young to face the possibility of widowhood. James began asking her about her plans for after Daniel's recovery, always phrasing his questions as if her departure was a foregone conclusion. "You're still so young, Alara," Margaret said during one of these conversations, reaching across the table to pat her hand with false sympathy. "You'll want to start fresh somewhere else when this is all over. Build a new life that isn't weighed down by all these painful memories." The first real betrayal came during Daniel's treatment. Alara had been handling his medical appointments and coordinating with doctors, but she discovered that James had been having separate conversations with the medical team, discussing treatment options and prognosis as if he were the primary decision-maker. When she confronted him about this, James claimed he was just trying to help, but the way he said it made it clear he considered himself more qualified to make important decisions than Daniel's actual wife. "Alara, I understand you're emotional about this situation," James had said, using the tone people reserve for children or animals. "But these are complex medical and financial decisions. Daniel needs family members who can think clearly about what's best for everyone involved." That night, Alara had cried herself to sleep while Daniel held her, promising that everything would be all right. What she didn't know was that Daniel had spent that same day meeting with his attorney, adding final details to legal documents that would ensure his family's greed would become their downfall. The second betrayal came in the form of documents that Margaret presented to Alara just 2 weeks before Daniel's death, papers that she claimed Daniel had asked her to prepare. They were modification documents for his will, changes that would provide Alara with a generous monthly allowance, while ensuring that family property remained with blood relatives. "Daniel is worried about your future," Margaret explained, her voice dripping with fake concern. "He wants to make sure you're taken care of, but he also knows how important it is to preserve what previous generations built. This way, you'll never have to worry about money, but the family legacy stays intact." Alara had refused to sign anything without Daniel present, but the fact that his own mother was trying to manipulate legal documents while he was dying revealed the depths of their callousness. When she told Daniel about the conversation, she watched something change in his eyes. The last traces of hope that his family might show basic human decency disappeared, replaced by a cold determination that she had never seen before. "Don't worry about them," Daniel had whispered, holding her close. "I've made sure you'll be protected. Promise me that when the time comes, you'll be strong enough to claim what's yours." She had promised, thinking he was talking about emotional strength to deal with grief. She had no idea he was talking about the strength she would need to face down an entire family who believed they could steal her inheritance through intimidation and lies. Daniel died on a Thursday morning in March, with Alara holding his hand and his family gathered around his bedside like vultures waiting for their moment to strike. His last words were whispered to her alone: "Remember the key, and remember that you're stronger than any of them will ever be." The funeral was held 3 days later in the estate's chapel, and Alara stood surrounded by 300 people who offered condolences with their mouths while calculating their potential inheritance with their eyes. She wore the black dress Daniel had bought for her during their honeymoon in Paris, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who was determined to honor her husband's memory regardless of what came next. What came next was swift and brutal. James Brooks wasted exactly 48 hours before making his move. On the Monday following the funeral, while Alara was still barely functional from grief, he appeared at her bedroom door with a team of estate attorneys and a stack of legal documents that would reshape her entire world. "Alara, I know this is difficult timing, but we need to discuss some practical matters," James said, settling into the chair beside her bed as if he belonged there. "Daniel's will has been probated, and there are some immediate decisions that need to be made about the estate." The will that James presented was not the document Alara expected. According to the papers spread across her comforter, Daniel had left her a modest trust fund that would provide enough money for a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, but nothing resembling the wealth she had assumed would be hers as his widow. The estate itself, along with the businesses and investment portfolios, had been left to a family trust managed by James, with various relatives listed as beneficiaries. "I don't understand," Alara said, staring at the documents that seemed to reduce her entire marriage to a footnote. "This can't be right. Daniel and I discussed our future together. He promised me that I would never have to worry about security." Margaret Brooks, who had been standing silently by the window, turned to face her with an expression that mixed pity with triumph. "Darling, I know Daniel cared about you, but you have to understand that men sometimes make promises in the heat of emotion that they can't actually keep. Family wealth comes with family responsibilities. Daniel knew that someone from your background wouldn't understand the complexities of managing an estate like this." The phrase, "someone from your background," hit Alara like a physical blow. After 3 years of marriage, after 2 years of caring for Daniel through his illness, after holding his hand while he died, they were still treating her like an outsider who had been granted temporary access to their world. James leaned forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone that wealthy people use when they're explaining why they deserve to keep things that don't belong to them. "The trust fund will provide you with $60,000 annually for the rest of your life. That's more than generous considering the circumstances. You'll be able to rent a nice apartment, maybe go back to school or start a small business. Daniel wanted to make sure you could build an independent life." $60,000. The amount James spent on wine in a typical year, offered to her as if it were a fortune instead of an insult. But the money wasn't the real devastation. The real catastrophe was the systematic way they dismantled her life piece by piece over the following weeks. First came the request that she move out of the master bedroom to make way for a guest suite renovation. Then came the suggestion that she might be more comfortable in one of the smaller guest houses while the main house was being reorganized for more efficient family use. Within 6 weeks of Daniel's death, Alara found herself living in what had essentially been converted servants' quarters, watching through her windows as moving trucks arrived to collect furniture and artwork that had once belonged to her husband. Margaret explained that these were family heirlooms that needed to be properly catalogued and distributed among the appropriate heirs. "You understand, don't you, dear?" Margaret said, supervising the removal of a painting that had hung in Alara's bedroom throughout her marriage. "These pieces have been in the Brooks family for generations. They belong with people who understand their historical significance. The staff began treating Elara differently too. The housekeeper who had worked for the family for 20 years started addressing her as Miss instead of Mrs. Brooks, a small change that carried enormous meaning. The groundskeeper stopped maintaining the gardens around her guest house. The security team received new instructions about which areas of the estate were off-limits to non-family members. Each day brought new humiliations designed to make her understand that her welcome had expired. James began scheduling family business meetings in rooms where she could see them through the windows, discussions about property management and financial planning that clearly involved decisions about her future without including her in the conversations. The worst part was how they managed to make each degradation seem reasonable, even generous. When they restricted her access to the estate's vehicles, James explained that maintaining insurance on multiple drivers was expensive and unnecessary. When they cancelled her credit cards tied to family accounts, Margaret suggested it would help her learn to live within her new means. When they changed the locks on the main house, they presented her with a schedule for when she could visit to collect her remaining personal belongings. "We're trying to help you transition to independence," Margaret said during one of their increasingly frequent conversations about Elara's future. "Staying here and living off Daniel's memory isn't healthy for anyone. You need to start building your own life." The transition they had in mind became clear when James presented her with lease documents for a 2-bedroom apartment in town, 45 minutes away from the estate. The apartment was nice enough, but it represented everything they had been working toward since Daniel's death, her complete removal from their world and their lives. "The security deposit and first 6 months of rent are covered," James explained, as if he were doing her an enormous favor. "This will give you time to get settled and figure out your next steps. The trust fund payments will start next month, so you'll have steady income to rely on." Elara stared at the lease agreement, understanding that she was looking at her forced exile. Accept the apartment and the modest trust fund, and she would disappear from their lives forever, reduced to a footnote in Daniel's history. Refuse, and they would find other ways to make her life impossible until she left on her own. But they had made one crucial mistake in their eagerness to erase her from the family legacy. They assumed that Daniel had been as naive about their intentions as Elara had been. They assumed that love had made him blind to their greed instead of opening his eyes to their true nature. That night, alone in the guest house that had become her prison, Elara opened the safety deposit box for the first time since Daniel's death. Inside, along with various documents she didn't yet understand, was a letter in Daniel's handwriting that began with words that would change everything. "My darling Elara, if you're reading this, it means my family has shown you exactly who they really are." The letter explained everything. How Daniel had spent the last 2 years of his life creating legal structures that would protect her from his family's greed. How the will they had shown her was real but incomplete, designed to give them a false sense of security while the true inheritance remained hidden. How every piece of property, every business asset, every investment account they believed belonged to them was actually held in trusts that would transfer to her control once she activated the proper legal mechanisms. "They will try to convince you that you're powerless," Daniel had written. "They will try to make you believe that you don't deserve the life we built together. But I've made sure that when you're ready to claim what's yours, you'll have everything you need to show them exactly how wrong they've been about you." The letter included instructions for contacting a specific attorney in the city, a woman named Victoria Chen who specialized in complex estate law and who had been quietly managing Daniel's real plans for the past 3 years. Victoria had been waiting for Elara's call, armed with documents that would prove the Brooks family had been systematically stealing from their own son's widow. But Daniel's final gift wasn't just legal protection. It was the chance for Elara to discover exactly how strong she could become when she had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The next morning, Elara signed the lease agreement for the apartment in town. But she wasn't surrendering. She was accepting their challenge, preparing to disappear just long enough to transform herself into someone they would never see coming. As she packed her belongings from the guest house, she could see Margaret and James standing on the main house terrace, sharing champagne as they watched her load boxes into her car. They thought they were celebrating their victory over the naive young woman who had briefly threatened their control over the family fortune. They had no idea they were actually toasting the beginning of their own downfall. The apartment James had chosen for Elara was deliberately modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that felt cramped after years of living in a house where the butler's pantry alone was larger than most people's entire kitchens. But what James hadn't considered was that modest didn't mean miserable, and isolation didn't mean defeat. For the first month, Elara played the role they expected perfectly. She appeared at the local grocery store looking appropriately subdued, dressed in simple clothes that suggested someone learning to live on a budget. She opened a checking account at the community bank and made polite conversation with the tellers about adjusting to life as a young widow. She even attended a grief support group at the local church, where she spoke quietly about missing her husband and struggling to find her place in the world. The performance was flawless because it wasn't entirely a performance. Elara was grieving, and she was struggling, but not for the reasons everyone assumed. She was grieving the naive woman she had been, the one who had believed that kindness and loyalty were universal values. She was struggling to contain the rage that built inside her every time she remembered Margaret's patronizing smile or James's reasonable explanations for why she deserved nothing. But while the Brooks family celebrated their successful removal of the gold-digging widow, Elara was meeting twice weekly with Victoria Chen in a downtown law office that specialized in exactly the kind of complex estate planning that wealthy families use to protect their assets from government taxes and greedy relatives. Victoria Chen was everything Margaret Brooks pretended to be: sharp, sophisticated, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting her clients' interests. She had been working with Daniel for 3 years, creating legal structures so complex that even experienced estate attorneys would need weeks to unravel them completely. "Your husband was brilliant," Victoria explained during their first meeting, spreading documents across her conference table like a general planning a military campaign. "He understood that his family would never respect your legal rights, so he made it impossible for them to challenge your inheritance through traditional means. They can't contest a will that gives you exactly what it says it gives you. They just don't understand what it actually gives you." The trust fund that provided Elara with $60,000 annually was real, but it was the smallest piece of a financial puzzle that included holdings they didn't even know existed. Daniel had spent 2 years quietly transferring assets into corporations and foundations where Elara was listed as the beneficiary or controlling partner, but under legal names and structures that wouldn't appear in standard estate searches. More importantly, the estate itself was held in a complex trust arrangement that appeared to give James management authority while actually giving Elara complete ownership once she activated specific legal triggers. The triggers required documentation that only she possessed, along with actions that could only be taken by someone with standing to challenge the family's current management of the property. "The beauty of Daniel's plan," Victoria continued, "is that your in-laws have to commit fraud before you can fully claim your inheritance. They have to misrepresent their ownership of assets that don't belong to them. They have to make public statements about their control over property they don't actually control. Essentially, they have to prove themselves guilty of stealing from you before you can prove yourself innocent of their accusations." While Elara learned the intricacies of trust law and asset protection, the Brooks family was making exactly the mistakes Daniel had predicted they would make. Within 2 months of Elara's departure, Margaret had begun hosting social events at the estate, introducing herself to guests as the lady of the house and making casual references to her relief at having resolved the Daniel situation successfully. James had moved into the master bedroom and begun making substantial changes to the property, including renovations that required permits listing him as the owner. He hired a new groundskeeping crew and updated the estate's insurance policies with himself as the primary contact and beneficiary. Most damaging to their future legal position, they began telling people in their social circle a story about Elara that painted her as a manipulative woman who had tried to take advantage of Daniel's illness to secure an inheritance she didn't deserve. "We're just grateful Daniel came to his senses before it was too late," Margaret told friends at the country club, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who believed she had saved her family from a terrible fate. That woman had him so confused during his illness that he was ready to leave her everything. Thank goodness James was able to help him understand the importance of keeping family assets within the family. The story spread through Crestwood's social circles with the speed that gossip travels among people who have nothing more important to discuss than other people's private business. Within months, Elara had been transformed from Daniel's beloved wife into a cautionary tale about the dangers of marrying outside your social class. But every public statement Margaret and James made about their ownership of the estate, every renovation they completed, every social event they hosted, created additional evidence that Victoria Chen was meticulously documenting. They were building a legal case against themselves without realizing it, creating a paper trail that would eventually prove they had been lying about their right to control assets that belonged to someone else. The most revealing moment came 6 months after Elara's departure, when James decided to refinance the estate's mortgage to fund additional renovations. The loan application required him to sign documents declaring himself the legal owner of the property, statements that would later be used to prove he had committed fraud by misrepresenting his ownership of assets that were actually held in trust for his brother's widow. "He's being incredibly stupid," Victoria observed, reviewing copies of the loan documents that the bank had processed. But stupidity driven by greed is exactly what Daniel expected from his family. They're so convinced they deserve to inherit everything that they can't imagine a scenario where they don't actually own what they think they own. While James committed himself to increasingly elaborate lies about his legal authority over the estate, Elara was undergoing a transformation that would have shocked anyone who remembered the quiet, accommodating woman who had tried so hard to win her in-laws' approval. She enrolled in business classes at the local community college, studying finance and property management with the intensity of someone preparing for war. She learned about wine production and vineyard management, areas of expertise that would be essential for eventually running the estate's agricultural operations. She studied art history and antique appraisal, preparing herself to understand the value of every piece of furniture and artwork that Margaret had removed from her home. Most importantly, she learned how to be alone without being lonely, how to be quiet without being weak, and how to be patient without being passive. The shy young woman who had once needed Daniel's protection was becoming someone who could protect herself and everything that mattered to her. The learning process wasn't easy. There were nights when Elara sat in her small apartment, staring at legal documents she barely understood, wondering if she was deluding herself about her ability to challenge a family that had generations of experience in getting exactly what they wanted. There were moments when the grief over losing Daniel felt overwhelming, when she questioned whether fighting for their shared legacy was worth the emotional cost of prolonged conflict with his relatives. But every time she felt tempted to give up, she remembered Daniel's letter and his promise that she was stronger than any of them would ever be. More importantly, she remembered the look of triumph on Margaret's face as they watched her pack her belongings, the satisfaction they had taken in what they believed was her final defeat. The turning point came almost exactly 1 year after Daniel's death, when Elara received a formal notice that the estate was being prepared for sale. James had decided that maintaining such a large property was financially impractical, and he had hired a prestigious auction house to liquidate the family assets and divide the proceeds among the legitimate heirs. The notice was addressed to Elara as a courtesy, informing her that she would be welcome to attend the auction if she wanted to bid on any items with sentimental value. The tone was patronizing, suggesting that they understood she might want to purchase a few small mementos of her marriage if her budget allowed. Victoria Chen smiled when Elara brought her the auction notice. "This is exactly what we've been waiting for," she said, pulling out a thick folder that contained 2 years of legal documentation. "They've just committed themselves to a public sale of property they don't own. Daniel's plan is perfect. They're going to auction the estate, and you're going to be there to inform everyone that they're trying to sell something that belongs to you." But Victoria's next words revealed the true complexity of Daniel's final gift to his wife. "The auction is just the beginning, Elara. Your husband didn't just want you to inherit his property. He wanted you to inherit his power. By the time this is over, you won't just own the estate. You'll own the mortgages on their new homes, the loans on their businesses, and the trust funds they've been living off since they threw you out. Daniel spent 2 years making sure that when you finally claimed your inheritance, it would include control over every aspect of their financial lives. That night, Elara stood at her apartment window looking toward the hill where the estate's lights twinkled in the distance. For more than a year, she had been the poor widow living in exile, dismissed and forgotten by people who had never bothered to learn her true worth. In 3 weeks, she would walk into that auction as the rightful owner of everything they had stolen from her. But more than that, she would walk in as someone who had earned the right to claim what was hers, someone who had spent a year in solitude becoming strong enough to face down an entire family of people who had underestimated her for the last time. The shy young woman who had once needed protection was about to become the person offering protection to others. And the family who had made the mistake of thinking kindness meant weakness was about to learn exactly how dangerous a truly strong woman could be when she finally stopped trying to make other people happy and started focusing on justice instead. The Crestwood estate auction was scheduled for a Saturday morning in April, exactly 13 months after Daniel's death. The auction house had spent weeks preparing for what they marketed as the sale of the century, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire pieces from one of the region's most prestigious family estates. Margaret Brooks had spent the previous month giving interviews to local society magazines about the difficult decision to sell the family home. She spoke eloquently about the burden of maintaining such a large property and the wisdom of liquidating assets to ensure the family's financial security for future generations. She positioned herself as a responsible matriarch making tough decisions for the greater good. Sometimes love means letting go, she told the lifestyle reporter from Crestwood Monthly, posed elegantly in the estate's main parlor. Daniel would understand that we need to be practical about preserving what matters most, the family legacy, not just the family property. James had been equally visible in his role as estate manager, meeting with potential buyers and coordinating with the auction house to ensure maximum returns on the family assets. He gave tours to serious collectors, pointing out the historical significance of various pieces and sharing stories about 4 generations of Brooks family history. What neither Margaret nor James realized was that every public statement they made, every interview they gave, every document they signed in preparation for the auction was being carefully documented by Victoria Chen's legal team. They were creating an extensive record of their claims to own property that actually belonged to someone else. The morning of the auction arrived with the kind of crisp spring weather that made everything seem possible. By 9 o'clock, the estate's main lawn was filled with white tents housing preview displays of furniture, artwork, and collectibles that represented more than a century of accumulated wealth. Potential bidders wandered between the displays, examining pieces that would soon be scattered to private collections across the country. Margaret stood near the main house, greeting friends and acquaintances with the gracious manner of someone hosting a sophisticated social event rather than dismantling her family's legacy. She wore a navy blue dress that struck exactly the right tone of dignity mixed with accessibility, the perfect outfit for a woman bravely facing difficult circumstances. James worked the crowd with practiced efficiency, shaking hands with serious collectors and representatives from major auction houses who had traveled from cities hundreds of miles away. He carried himself with the confident authority of someone who owned everything around him and was generous enough to share it with people who appreciated quality. The auction itself was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock with smaller items before moving to major pieces of furniture and artwork. The estate itself would be offered as the final lot, with bidding expected to reach well into the millions for a property that included the main house, guest houses, working vineyards, and more than 200 acres of prime real estate. At 9:45, Elara Brooks walked through the estate's main gates for the first time in 13 months. She looked nothing like the broken young widow who had been exiled from her home over a year earlier. Her hair, which had been long and soft during her marriage, was now cut in a sleek bob that framed her face with geometric precision. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was clearly expensive but understated, the kind of outfit that suggested serious money without shouting about it. Most importantly, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The first person to notice her arrival was Margaret's sister Patricia, who had been examining a display of crystal stemware when she spotted the familiar figure walking calmly across the lawn. Patricia's gasp was loud enough to attract attention from several nearby bidders, and within minutes word had spread through the crowd that Daniel's widow had returned. Margaret's reaction was swift and sharp. She excused herself from a conversation with potential buyers and moved quickly across the lawn to intercept Elara before she could disrupt the carefully orchestrated event. "Elara, what a surprise," Margaret said, her voice carrying the kind of false warmth that fooled no one who was paying attention. "I didn't expect to see you here today. I hope you're not planning to bid on anything too expensive. Some of these pieces are likely to go for quite a bit more than your budget would allow." Elara smiled with the serene expression of someone who was completely at peace with herself and her circumstances. "Actually, Margaret, I'm not here to bid on anything. I'm here because this auction cannot proceed as planned." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Margaret felt the first flutter of something that might have been nervousness. But she had spent more than a year convincing herself that Elara was powerless, and she wasn't ready to abandon that belief based on one cryptic statement. "I'm not sure what you mean, dear," Margaret replied, her tone shifting to the patient voice she used with children or confused elderly relatives. "The auction has been properly organized and legally approved. If you're concerned about something, perhaps you should speak with the auction house representatives." James had noticed the commotion and was walking quickly toward them, followed by several family members who sensed that something important was happening. The crowd of potential bidders had also begun to gather, drawn by the obvious tension between the elegantly dressed stranger and the woman they had been told was the estate's owner. "The auction cannot proceed," Elara repeated, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn, "because the Brooks family does not own the property they are attempting to sell." The statement hit the crowd like a physical force. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people turned to stare at the young woman who had just accused one of Crestwood's most prominent families of fraud. Margaret's face went white, then flushed red as she struggled to process what she was hearing. "That's absolutely ridiculous," James said, reaching the group and immediately taking control of the situation. "I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play, Elara, but this is neither the time nor the place for whatever delusions you've developed about your legal rights." Elara reached into her purse and withdrew a folder containing documents that Victoria Chen had prepared for exactly this moment. "These are the deed transfers, trust documents, and ownership records that prove I am the sole owner of this estate and everything on it. The Brooks family has been living here illegally for the past 13 months, and they are now attempting to sell property that belongs to me." The auction house representative, a distinguished man in his 60s who had been watching the exchange with growing alarm, stepped forward to examine the documents. His expression changed from skepticism to shock as he reviewed page after page of legal paperwork that clearly established Elara's ownership of the estate. "I'm going to need to halt this auction immediately," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades handling high-stakes transactions. "We cannot proceed with the sale of any items until these ownership claims are properly resolved." Margaret snatched the documents from his hands, scanning them desperately for some indication that they were fraudulent or incomplete. But Daniel's planning had been meticulous, and Victoria Chen's preparation had been flawless. Every signature was legitimate, every legal reference was accurate, and every transfer was properly recorded with the appropriate government offices. "This is impossible," Margaret whispered, but her voice was loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "Daniel wouldn't have done this. He wouldn't have left everything to her and nothing to his own family." James grabbed his mother's arm, trying to pull her away from the crowd that was now watching their family crisis unfold like a public entertainment. But Margaret was beyond caring about appearances. The foundation of everything she had believed about her place in the world was crumbling in real time. "You manipulated him," she said, turning on Alara with the desperate fury of someone whose entire identity was being destroyed. You took advantage of a sick man and convinced him to betray his own family. You're nothing but a gold-digging whore who seduced my son and stole his inheritance. The crowd gasped at Margaret's outburst, but Alara remained perfectly calm. She had spent 13 months preparing for this moment, and she was ready for anything the Brooks family could throw at her. Actually, Margaret, Alara said, her voice carrying easily across the silent lawn, I'm exactly what I've always been, Daniel's wife and the legal owner of his estate. The difference is that now I'm also someone who understands the value of what I inherited and the worthlessness of people who try to steal it. James was studying the documents with the desperate intensity of someone looking for a life raft on a sinking ship. But Daniel's legal planning had been designed specifically to withstand challenges from his family, and every potential loophole had been carefully closed. The renovations, James said suddenly, his voice hollow with realization. The mortgage refinancing. The insurance policies. If these documents are legitimate, then I've been committing fraud, Alara finished quietly. For over a year, you've been claiming ownership of property that belongs to me. You've been living in my house, spending my money, and planning to sell my assets. The legal term for that is theft, James. And the evidence of your theft has been accumulating every day since you forced me to leave. The assembled crowd was now completely silent, watching the destruction of a family's reputation in real time. Margaret Brooks, who had spent decades building her image as Crestwood's premier social hostess, was standing in the ruins of everything she thought she controlled. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Alara withdrew a second folder from her purse, this one containing documents that would complete the destruction of the Brooks family's financial security. The estate is just the beginning, she continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who held all the cards. Daniel also left me controlling interests in the businesses you've been managing, the trust funds you've been living off, and the investment accounts you've been using to finance your lifestyles. As of today, all of those assets revert to my control. James felt his knees buckle as he understood the full scope of what his brother had done. Daniel hadn't just protected Alara from their greed. He had positioned her to control every aspect of their financial lives, making them completely dependent on the woman they had spent a year dismissing as powerless. Margaret was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, unable to process the reality that her entire life had been built on a lie. The house she had been living in, the money she had been spending, the social position she had been enjoying, all of it belonged to the young woman she had treated like a temporary inconvenience. This isn't over, Margaret whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. She was looking at legal documents that had been prepared by experts and filed with government offices. There would be no successful challenge to Alara's ownership, no legal loophole that would restore their control over assets they had never actually owned. Alara closed her folders and turned to address the crowd of potential bidders who had witnessed the complete collapse of everything the Brooks family thought they understood about their place in the world. The auction is cancelled, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent lawn. But I want to thank everyone for coming today. You've helped me demonstrate that justice doesn't always arrive with fanfare and drama. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying legal documents and wearing a charcoal gray suit. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed, Margaret and James Brooks stood alone on the lawn of the estate they had never actually owned, finally understanding that the naive young woman they had dismissed as harmless had spent 13 months becoming the most dangerous enemy they could have imagined. The poor widow on the hill had revealed herself to be the richest woman in Crestwood, and the family who had stolen from her was about to learn exactly what it felt like to have nothing left to lose. The aftermath of the cancelled auction spread through Crestwood like wildfire. By Monday morning, every person who mattered in the town's social hierarchy had heard some version of what had happened at the Brooks estate. The story grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core facts remained unchanged. the grieving widow everyone had dismissed had revealed herself as the rightful owner of everything the Brooks family thought belonged to them. Margaret Brooks spent the weekend locked in her bedroom, alternating between rage and despair as the full scope of her situation became clear. The house she had been living in wasn't hers. The furniture she had been using wasn't hers. The bank accounts she had been accessing weren't hers. Even the clothes in her closet had been purchased with money that belonged to Daniel's wife. James was dealing with more immediate legal problems. The mortgage he had secured using the estate as collateral was now in default, since he had fraudulently claimed ownership of property that belonged to someone else. The bank's lawyers were already filing paperwork to recover their losses, and the district attorney's office had opened an investigation into possible criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. But the Brooks family's financial destruction was only the beginning of their problems. Within days of the auction debacle, their carefully maintained social position began crumbling as friends and business associates distanced themselves from people who had been exposed as thieves and liars. Margaret's longtime friends at the country club suddenly became unavailable for lunch dates. The charity boards where she had served for decades politely requested her resignation, citing the need to avoid any appearance of impropriety while her legal situation was resolved. The society reporters who had once courted her opinions about fashion and entertaining now treated her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and greed. James faced even more severe consequences. The business partnerships that had provided much of his income were dissolved as clients refused to work with someone whose judgment and honesty had been so publicly questioned. The board positions that had given him influence in Crestwood's business community were revoked. Even his membership at the exclusive men's club where he had networked for years was suspended pending resolution of his legal troubles. For Elara, victory came with complications she hadn't anticipated. While she had legally reclaimed everything that belonged to her, the social dynamics of her triumph were more complex than simply moving back into her house and resuming her life. The community that had watched the Brooks family's destruction was now divided in their reactions to the woman who had orchestrated it. Some people admired her strength and intelligence, viewing her as someone who had refused to be victimized by wealthy bullies. But others saw her as a calculating manipulator who had destroyed a prominent family through legal technicalities and emotional manipulation. She played the poor widow perfectly, whispered the gossips at the farmer's market, dissecting Elara's behavior with the cruel precision of people who enjoyed other people's drama. Living in that little apartment, attending grief counseling, acting so humble and broken. Meanwhile she was planning this whole thing with lawyers and building a case against people who were just trying to preserve their family legacy. The narrative that emerged in certain circles painted Elara as a woman who had seduced a sick man, manipulated him into changing his will, and then spent months plotting revenge against his grieving family. The fact that Daniel had been planning for years to protect her from his relatives' greed was lost in the more dramatic story of a gold digger who had played a long game to steal a family's inheritance. Even some of Daniel's friends, people who had known him for decades, began questioning whether Elara had somehow influenced his decisions during his illness. They couldn't believe that the Daniel they remembered would have deliberately destroyed his own family's financial security to benefit a woman he had known for only a few years. Daniel was always generous, but this goes beyond generosity, said Robert Hamilton, who had been Daniel's college roommate and best man at his wedding. Leaving everything to Elara and nothing to his mother and brother. That doesn't sound like the man I knew. I have to wonder what kind of pressure she put on him during those final months. The social isolation was painful for Elara, but it was also revealing. She discovered which of her relationships had been based on genuine affection and which had been tied to her position as Daniel Brooks' wife. Several women who had seemed like close friends during her marriage now crossed the street to avoid having to speak with her. Former neighbors who had been warm and welcoming when she lived at the estate now treated her with suspicious politeness when they encountered her in town. Most hurtful was the reaction from some of Daniel's extended family, cousins and relatives who hadn't been directly involved in Margaret and James's schemes but who now viewed Elara as someone who had destroyed family unity for personal gain. They organized themselves into a support network for Margaret and James, helping them find temporary housing and providing emotional support during their legal battles. Family should take care of family, declared Daniel's cousin Patricia, organizing a fundraising dinner to help Margaret and James pay their legal fees. I don't care what the paperwork says. Those people raised Daniel, loved him, and deserved better than to be thrown out of their home by someone who knew him for barely 3 years. The fundraising dinner was held at the country club, and the guest list included many of the same people who had attended Daniel and Alara's wedding 4 years earlier. The contrast was stark, where once they had celebrated the union of two people in love, they now gathered to support the family that had been betrayed by that same love. But Alara's most difficult challenge wasn't social disapproval or financial complexity. It was the emotional weight of living alone in the house where she had been happiest with Daniel, surrounded by reminders of their life together but without his presence to make the space feel like home. The estate felt different now that she owned it completely. During her marriage, it had been a place where she was learning to belong, where Daniel helped her navigate the complexities of living in a house with centuries of family history. Now it was simply hers, all 12 bedrooms and formal dining rooms and wine cellars that she had no particular need for or interest in. She found herself avoiding the master bedroom where Daniel had died, sleeping instead in one of the guest rooms that held fewer painful memories. The kitchen where she had tried to learn Margaret's family recipes felt too large for someone cooking meals for one. The library where she and Daniel had spent quiet evenings reading together now felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. The vineyards and gardens that had once seemed charming now represented enormous responsibility and expense. Alara had to hire staff to maintain the property, manage the agricultural operations, and handle the day-to-day complexities of running what was essentially a small business. The education she had gotten during her year of exile helped, but the practical realities of managing a working estate were overwhelming for someone with no previous experience. Worst of all was the constant reminder that her victory over the Brooks family had come at the cost of relationships and community connections that couldn't be easily replaced. She had won the legal battle for her inheritance, but she had lost most of the social support system that had made Crestwood feel like home. The Brooks family, meanwhile, was discovering what it felt like to live without the financial cushion they had taken for granted their entire lives. Margaret moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of town, furnished with pieces she had managed to purchase before the extent of her legal troubles became clear. The woman who had once hosted elaborate dinner parties for 50 people now struggled to afford groceries for herself. James faced criminal charges that could result in prison time if he was convicted of fraud and embezzlement. The legal fees were consuming what little money he had managed to save independently of the family trusts that were now controlled by Alara. His wife had filed for divorce, unwilling to be associated with someone whose reputation and financial prospects had been so thoroughly destroyed. But neither Margaret nor James was prepared to accept defeat gracefully. Instead of acknowledging their mistakes and trying to rebuild their lives, they became increasingly desperate and vindictive in their attempts to reclaim what they believed should have been theirs. Margaret began making public statements about Alara's character, giving interviews to anyone who would listen about the manipulation and deceit that had resulted in her family's destruction. She painted herself as a grieving mother who had been victimized by a calculating woman who had taken advantage of her son's illness to steal his inheritance. James hired a team of private investigators to look for evidence that Alara had somehow coerced Daniel into changing his will or that the legal documents were fraudulent. He spent his remaining savings on attorneys who promised they could find loopholes in the estate planning that would restore his family's control over the property. Their desperation made them increasingly reckless in their accusations and increasingly isolated from people who might have been willing to help them rebuild their lives. Friends and relatives who had initially offered support began backing away as Margaret and James became consumed with bitterness and revenge fantasies. The investigation into James's financial crimes was progressing steadily, with prosecutors building a case that would likely result in significant prison time. The civil lawsuits related to the fraudulent mortgage and insurance claims were also moving forward, threatening to consume any assets he had managed to hide from Ilara's inheritance claims. For Ilara, watching the Brooks family's self-destruction was both satisfying and deeply sad. She had wanted justice for the way they had treated her, but she hadn't anticipated how completely their greed and arrogance would destroy not just their financial security but their relationships with everyone who had ever cared about them. As winter settled over the estate, Ilara found herself living in isolation that felt almost as complete as her exile had been. The difference was that now she was isolated by choice rather than by force, and she owned everything around her rather than being dependent on others' generosity. But ownership without connection felt hollow, and justice without community felt incomplete. She had won everything Daniel had wanted her to have, but she was beginning to understand that having everything wasn't the same as having enough. The woman who had spent a year learning to be strong was now learning that strength without purpose was just another form of emptiness. The estate that represented her victory over people who had underestimated her was becoming a monument to loneliness that no amount of legal vindication could fill. Something had to change, but Ilara wasn't yet sure what that change should look like or whether she had the courage to make it. The turning point came on a February morning when Ilara discovered she wasn't the only person the Brooks family had victimized over the years. She was in Daniel's old office, finally working up the courage to go through his personal papers, when she found a folder labeled "Employee Concerns" that contained documentation spanning nearly a decade. Inside were termination letters, legal settlements, and correspondence related to staff members who had been fired or forced out of Brooks family businesses under questionable circumstances. The pattern was clear: whenever an employee became too valuable, too knowledgeable, or too expensive to maintain, James would find reasons to eliminate their positions. Then he would restructure their responsibilities among remaining staff, essentially stealing their expertise while avoiding the cost of proper compensation. The most recent case involved Maria Santos, who had managed the estate's vineyards for 8 years before being terminated just 3 months before Daniel's death. According to the documents, Maria had developed innovative organic farming techniques that significantly increased grape quality and wine production. But when she requested a promotion and salary increase that reflected her contributions, James had fired her for performance issues and hired a less experienced manager at half her salary. Ilara remembered Maria vaguely from her time living at the estate, a quiet woman in her 40s who seemed to know everything about the land and spoke to the vines as if they were old friends. She had disappeared shortly before Daniel's illness became serious, and Ilara had assumed she had found a better position elsewhere. The folder contained Maria's contact information along with notes Daniel had made about wanting to restore her position once he recovered from his treatment. He had recognized her value even if his family hadn't, and he had been planning to make things right. That afternoon, Ilara drove to the address listed in Maria's file, a small house about 20 minutes from the estate. She found Maria in her backyard, tending a garden that demonstrated the same careful attention to plant health that had made the estate's vineyards so successful. "Mrs. Brooks," Maria said, clearly surprised to see her former employer's widow standing at her back gate. "I heard about what happened at the auction. I'm sorry for everything you've been through." Ilara realized that Maria was one of the few people in Crestwood who spoke to her without either hostility or pity in her voice. She seemed genuinely concerned about Ilara's well-being rather than curious about the drama that had destroyed the Brooks family. "Actually, I came to apologize to you," Ilara said, leaning against the garden fence. "I found Daniel's notes about how James treated you, and I wanted you to know that Daniel never approved of what happened. He was planning to bring you back." Maria's expression softened as she set down her pruning shears. Mr. Daniel was always fair. He understood that the land needs people who care about it, not just people who want to profit from it. But his family. She shrugged diplomatically, unwilling to speak ill of people who had caused her obvious pain. They talked for nearly 2 hours, with Maria explaining the innovations she had developed for sustainable vineyard management and Ilara asking questions about the estate's agricultural potential that went far beyond simple wine production. Maria described plans she had developed for expanding into organic produce, creating educational programs about sustainable farming, and building partnerships with local restaurants and farmers markets. The land could support so much more than it does now, Maria explained, walking Alara through her backyard demonstration plots. But it would require someone who cares about community benefit, not just individual profit. The Brooks family was never interested in anything that didn't directly increase their personal wealth. As Alara listened to Maria's vision for what the estate could become, she began to see possibilities she had never considered. The property that had felt like a burden and a monument to loneliness could become something that served the entire community while honoring Daniel's memory in ways that simply preserving family wealth never could. That evening, Alara called Victoria Chen to discuss the legal and financial implications of transforming the estate from a private residence into a working agricultural and educational center. Victoria's response was immediately enthusiastic. "It's brilliant," Victoria said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who recognized a perfect solution to multiple problems. "You transform the estate into a non-profit foundation focused on sustainable agriculture and community education. You get tax benefits, community support, and a meaningful purpose for all that property. Most importantly, you rewrite the narrative about who you are and what you represent." The legal structure Victoria proposed would allow Alara to maintain control over the property while using it to benefit the broader community. The estate would become a center for agricultural education, sustainable farming research, and local food production. Maria could return as the director of operations, leading programs that would teach sustainable farming techniques to other local producers. But the transformation would require Alara to make a choice that went far beyond legal and financial considerations. She would have to decide whether she wanted to remain isolated in her victory over the Brooks family or use that victory as the foundation for building something larger than personal revenge. The decision became even more complex when Victoria shared information about additional properties that Daniel had left in Alara's control. The estate was just the most visible piece of an inheritance that included commercial real estate, farmland, and business interests throughout the region. Alara had the resources to create something significant, but only if she was willing to engage with the community that had largely turned against her. "You have the power to reshape not just your own life, but the economic landscape of this entire area," Victoria explained during their meeting. "But power without purpose is just wealth, and wealth without community is just isolation. Daniel gave you the tools to build something lasting. The question is whether you have the courage to use them." The courage question became more pressing when Alara began reaching out to other people who had been harmed by the Brooks family's business practices over the years. Maria's case wasn't unique. James had a decades-long pattern of exploiting employees, contractors, and business partners, taking their ideas and contributions while minimizing their compensation and recognition. There was Roberto Martinez, a landscaper who had developed innovative water conservation techniques for the estate's gardens before being fired when he requested fair payment for his designs. There was Sarah Chen, an event coordinator who had built the estate's wedding and catering business into a profitable enterprise before being eliminated when James decided to handle those services in-house with cheaper temporary staff. Each conversation revealed the same pattern: talented people who had contributed significantly to the Brooks family's success, only to be discarded when their value was established and their knowledge could be replicated by less expensive alternatives. But these conversations also revealed something else: a community of skilled, creative people who had been waiting for the opportunity to work for someone who valued their contributions rather than simply exploiting their talents. "I never thought I'd work for the Brooks family again," Roberto said when Alara contacted him about potential landscaping projects for the estate's transformation. "But you're not really the Brooks family, are you? You're something different. Someone who might actually appreciate what people like us can accomplish when we're treated fairly." The choice Alara faced was becoming clearer: she could remain the wealthy widow who had defeated her enemies through superior legal planning, or she could become the person who used that victory to create opportunities for others who had been similarly victimized by greed and arrogance. The decision was made easier by her growing realization that isolation, even comfortable and legally justified isolation, wasn't sustainable for someone who had spent her entire adult life believing in the power of community and connection. Daniel had left her the tools to seek revenge against his family, but he had also left her the resources to build something that would outlast any personal conflict. The estate could become a place where people like Maria, Roberto, and Sarah could develop their talents without fear of exploitation, where sustainable practices could be developed and shared, where community building could happen through shared work rather than shared gossip. On a cold morning in early March, Elara stood in the estate's main vineyard, looking out over acres of dormant vines that would soon burst into the new growth of spring. She had spent months thinking of this land as her inheritance, her prize for surviving the Brooks family's attempts to destroy her. But now she was beginning to see it as something larger, her responsibility to create something worthy of Daniel's love and sacrifice, something that would transform the pain of the past few years into purpose for the future. The woman who had spent a year learning to be strong enough to claim what was hers was now ready to become someone strong enough to share what she had with people who needed it most. The choice wasn't really between isolation and community. It was between being someone who had won a victory and being someone who deserved the victory she had won. That afternoon, Elara called Maria Santos and offered her a position as director of the Brooks Estate Agricultural and Educational Foundation, a non-profit organization that would transform the family property into a center for sustainable farming education and community food production. "I can't promise it will be easy," Elara told her during their conversation. "There are still people in this community who see me as the woman who destroyed a prominent family rather than someone who's trying to build something positive. But I can promise that your work will be valued, your innovations will be supported, and your contributions will be recognized." Maria's acceptance marked the beginning of Elara's transformation from someone who had survived victimization to someone who was actively working to prevent others from experiencing similar harm. The poor widow on the hill was becoming something neither she nor the Brooks family had ever imagined, a woman with the resources, knowledge, and determination to reshape an entire community's understanding of what power could accomplish when it was used for creation rather than destruction. The grand opening of the Brooks Estate Agricultural and Educational Foundation was scheduled for the first Saturday in June, exactly 18 months after the cancelled auction that had exposed the Brooks family's theft and lies. What Elara hadn't planned was that the celebration would coincide perfectly with James Brooks' sentencing hearing for fraud and embezzlement, creating a day when justice and triumph would intersect in ways that even Daniel couldn't have orchestrated. The transformation of the estate had been remarkable. Working with Maria Santos and the team of previously exploited employees that Elara had assembled, they had converted the property into a thriving center for sustainable agriculture education. The former guest houses now served as classrooms and research facilities. The ornate dining rooms had been converted into community meeting spaces where local farmers could share knowledge and coordinate sustainable practices. The wine cellars had become seed libraries and food storage facilities for the community cooperative that distributed fresh produce to families throughout the region. Most importantly, the estate had become a place where people worked together toward shared goals rather than competing for individual advantage. Maria's innovative farming techniques were being taught to farmers throughout the region, increasing crop yields while reducing environmental impact. Roberto Martinez had developed water conservation systems that were being replicated on farms across 3 counties. Sarah Chen had created event management programs that helped local businesses host sustainable celebrations and conferences. The success had been immediate and dramatic. Within 6 months of the foundation's establishment, the estate was producing more food than it ever had under Brooks family management, while also providing education and support services that benefited hundreds of local families. The sustainable practices developed at the foundation were being adopted by agricultural operations throughout the region, creating an economic impact that extended far beyond the estate's boundaries. But the personal transformation had been even more significant. Elara had discovered that using her resources to create opportunities for others was infinitely more satisfying than simply owning beautiful things or commanding respect through wealth. The woman who had once tried desperately to win approval from people who would never accept her had become someone who earned genuine respect by helping others achieve their own goals. The grand opening celebration was planned as both a community festival and a demonstration of everything the foundation had accomplished. Local families would tour the facilities, participate in hands-on farming workshops, and enjoy meals prepared entirely from produce grown on the estate using the sustainable techniques that were being taught throughout the region. More than 500 people had confirmed their attendance, including agricultural experts from universities across the country, government officials interested in replicating the foundation's programs, and journalists documenting the transformation of a private estate into a community resource. The event represented everything Alara had hoped to achieve, proof that Daniel's legacy could be something larger and more lasting than the preservation of family wealth. What she hadn't expected was that Margaret Brooks would choose the foundation's grand opening as the occasion for one final, desperate attempt to destroy Alara's reputation and reclaim what she still believed should have belonged to her family. Margaret had spent the 18 months since the auction living in increasingly dire circumstances. The criminal investigation had frozen most of her remaining assets, and the civil lawsuits related to her participation in James's fraudulent schemes had consumed her savings on legal fees. She had been forced to move 3 times as landlords decided they didn't want to rent to someone whose name appeared regularly in newspaper articles about fraud and embezzlement. But worse than the financial hardship was the social isolation. The woman who had once been Crestwood's premier hostess was now persona non grata at every social gathering that mattered. Former friends crossed the street to avoid having to acknowledge her. The charity organizations where she had once held leadership positions had removed her from their boards and deleted her from their membership rolls. The psychological impact of losing everything she had used to define her worth had pushed Margaret toward increasingly erratic behavior. She became obsessed with proving that Alara had somehow manipulated Daniel into betraying his family, convinced that exposing this alleged manipulation would restore her social position and financial security. Margaret had spent months collecting what she believed was evidence of Alara's deception. She had interviewed former estate employees, looking for proof that Alara had isolated Daniel from his family during his illness. She had hired private investigators to examine Alara's financial records, searching for evidence of hidden assets or suspicious transactions. She had even contacted medical professionals who had treated Daniel, hoping to find evidence that he had been mentally incompetent when he made his estate planning decisions. But every investigation had reached the same conclusion: Daniel Brooks had been entirely competent when he created the legal structures that protected Alara from his family's greed, and his decisions had been based on years of observing his relatives' behavior rather than any manipulation by his wife. The failure to find evidence that supported her narrative had only intensified Margaret's desperation. She became convinced that Alara's transformation of the estate into a community resource was actually an elaborate public relations campaign designed to hide her true nature as a calculating gold digger who had stolen a family's inheritance. On the morning of the foundation's grand opening, Margaret arrived at the estate uninvited, dressed in a kind of expensive outfit that she could no longer afford but had preserved for special occasions. She carried with her a folder of documents that she believed would finally expose Alara's true character to the community that had begun to admire her work. The celebration was already in full swing when Margaret appeared. Families were touring the sustainable farming demonstrations, children were participating in educational activities about plant growth and soil health, and local restaurants were serving meals prepared with ingredients grown on the estate. The atmosphere was festive and collaborative, exactly the kind of community gathering that Alara had hoped to create. Alara was leading a group of visiting agricultural experts through the greenhouse facilities when someone alerted her that Margaret Brooks was on the property, demanding to speak with her about urgent matters related to the estate's ownership. When Alara found Margaret, she was standing near the main house, surrounded by a small crowd of celebration attendees who had recognized her and were listening with fascination as she ranted about fraud, manipulation, and stolen inheritances. "This entire foundation is built on lies," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying across the lawn with the desperate intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose. "That woman stole everything that belonged to my family, and now she's using our money to buy herself a reputation as some kind of community benefactor. It's all fake, all calculated to make people forget what she really is." Elara approached the group calmly, recognizing that this confrontation had been inevitable since the day Margaret had been forced to acknowledge her powerlessness. The woman who had once dismissed her as a gold-digging nobody was now making a public spectacle of herself in a desperate attempt to reclaim relevance. "Margaret," Elara said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was completely comfortable with her position and her choices. "You're welcome to stay for the celebration, but I'd appreciate it if you could avoid disrupting the educational activities that people came here to enjoy." Margaret turned on her with the fury of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered by legal documents and court proceedings. "Don't you dare act like you belong here," she spat, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear every word. "This is my family's home, my family's land, and you stole it through manipulation and lies. Daniel never would have left you everything if you hadn't poisoned his mind against his own mother." The accusation hung in the air, and Elara realized that Margaret had chosen this moment and this audience for a reason. She wanted to destroy the Foundation's celebration by forcing Elara to defend herself against allegations of elder abuse and manipulation, hoping to plant seeds of doubt about Elara's character that would undermine everything she had built. But Margaret had made a crucial miscalculation. The people gathered around them weren't strangers who might be swayed by dramatic accusations. They were community members who had worked directly with Elara for more than a year, people who had witnessed her character through her actions rather than her words. Maria Santos stepped forward from the crowd, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had worked for both the old Brooks family management and the new Foundation leadership. "Mrs. Brooks," Maria said, addressing Margaret with respectful firmness. "I worked for your family for 8 years, and I've worked for Mrs. Elara for the past year. I can tell you that Mr. Daniel saw exactly who his family was long before he became ill. The legal documents he created weren't the result of manipulation. They were the result of a man who understood the difference between people who take from others and people who give to others." Roberto Martinez nodded his agreement, adding his own perspective as someone who had been exploited by James Brooks for years before finding fair treatment working for the Foundation. "Your son James stole my work, my designs, and my ideas for years," Roberto said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind his words. "He took what I created and used it to increase his profits while paying me less than minimum wage. Mrs. Elara hired me back at twice what your family ever paid me, and she makes sure I get credit for my innovations. Mr. Daniel knew exactly what kind of people his family were." One by one, other Foundation employees and community members began sharing their own experiences with the Brooks family's exploitation and Elara's fair treatment. The pattern was unmistakable. Daniel's family had spent decades taking advantage of people they considered beneath their social status, while Elara had spent the past year creating opportunities for those same people to thrive. Margaret's folder of documents, which she had planned to present as evidence of Elara's deception, remained unopened as the crowd heard testimony from people who had worked directly with both management styles. Her accusations of manipulation and theft sounded increasingly hollow when compared to the concrete examples of her family's actual theft and manipulation that were being shared by their victims. The final blow to Margaret's credibility came when Victoria Chen arrived at the celebration, having driven directly from the courthouse where James Brooks had just been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. "James Brooks was sentenced this morning," Victoria announced to the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the estate grounds. "The judge found that he had systematically stolen from employees, contractors, and business partners for more than a decade, using his family's social position to avoid accountability for criminal behavior. The restitution he owes to his victims exceeds $2 million. The crowd absorbed this information in stunned silence, understanding that Margaret's son had just been convicted of exactly the kinds of crimes she was now accusing Elara of committing. Victoria continued, "The judge specifically noted that Mr. Daniel Brooks's estate planning showed remarkable foresight in protecting assets from family members who had demonstrated a pattern of fraud and theft. Far from being manipulation, the legal structures Mr. Daniel created were a responsible response to criminal behavior by his relatives. Margaret stared at Victoria as if she were speaking a foreign language, unable to process the reality that her son was now a convicted felon while the woman she had been trying to destroy was being praised by federal judges for her husband's wisdom and her own integrity. The crowd began to disperse, returning to the celebration activities with a new understanding of exactly why Daniel Brooks had chosen to protect his wife from his family and why Alara's transformation of the estate represented justice rather than theft. Margaret remained standing alone near the main house, holding her folder of useless documents, finally understanding that her family's crimes had been exposed and punished while Alara's character had been vindicated by every person who had actually worked with her. As the sun set over the estate that evening, Alara stood surrounded by hundreds of community members who were celebrating not just the foundation's success, but the triumph of values they recognized and respected: hard work, fair treatment, and the use of resources to benefit others rather than exploit them. The poor widow on the hill had become the woman who proved that sometimes the best revenge against people who try to destroy you is building something so beautiful and beneficial that their destruction of themselves becomes irrelevant to your happiness. Margaret Brooks walked slowly to her car, leaving behind the estate that had never actually belonged to her family, defeated not by legal maneuvering or public relations campaigns, but by the simple truth that character revealed through action is more powerful than accusations whispered in desperation. The foundation's grand opening had become something larger than a celebration. It had become a public demonstration that justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it simply reveals itself through the contrast between people who build and people who destroy, between those who create opportunities for others and those who steal opportunities from others. Daniel Brooks's final gift to his wife hadn't just been financial security. It had been the chance to discover that she was strong enough to transform pain into purpose, wealthy enough to share rather than hoard, and wise enough to understand that the best way to honor love is to love others in return. 2 years after the grand opening of the Brooks Estate Agricultural and Educational Foundation, Alara stood in the same vineyard where she had once contemplated her impossible choice between isolation and community. But everything around her had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those dark months following Daniel's death. The foundation had grown far beyond what even she had imagined possible. What had started as a way to transform personal pain into community purpose had become a model for sustainable agriculture that was being replicated in rural communities across the country. Agricultural universities were sending students to study the innovative farming techniques developed by Maria and her team. Government agencies were providing grants to support the educational programs that had helped more than 200 local families improve their farming operations and increase their incomes. The estate itself was thriving in ways it never had under Brooks family management. The vineyards were producing award-winning wines using organic methods that had been refined through careful experimentation and community collaboration. The vegetable gardens were supplying fresh produce to restaurants and farmers' markets throughout the region, creating a local food network that supported dozens of small businesses. More importantly, the foundation had become a gathering place where people came together to share knowledge, celebrate successes, and support each other through challenges. The woman who had once felt isolated by her wealth had created a community where financial resources were used to lift everyone rather than separate anyone. James Brooks had been released from federal prison after serving 3 years of his 4-year sentence, emerging into a world where his previous social connections had evaporated and his business reputation had been permanently destroyed. The restitution payments required by his conviction had consumed what little money he had managed to hide from the estate proceedings, leaving him to rebuild his life from nothing at the age of 52. He had found work as a bookkeeper for a small construction company, grateful for any employment that would hire someone with a felony conviction for financial crimes. The man who had once managed millions of dollars in family assets now lived in a studio apartment and took public transportation to a job that paid less in a year than he had once spent on wine. The humbling had been complete and, according to people who encountered him, surprisingly transformative. James had enrolled in community college business classes, not to reclaim his former status but to learn skills that would help him build an honest living. He had joined a support group for people rebuilding their lives after incarceration, and he had begun volunteering with programs that helped other former convicts find employment and housing. "I spent my whole life thinking I deserved things because of who my family was," James had told his parole officer during one of their regular meetings. "It took losing everything to understand that the only thing anyone deserves is the chance to earn what they have through honest work." Margaret Brooks had not adapted as well to her changed circumstances. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through her social position and family wealth had never learned to find meaning in anything else. After James's conviction, she had moved to Florida to live with her sister, but the relationship had deteriorated when Margaret's bitterness and constant complaints about her treatment became unbearable even for family. She had spent her final years in a modest assisted living facility, supported by a small pension that was all that remained of her previous financial security. According to her former neighbors, she had never stopped talking about the estate that should have been hers and the woman who had stolen it through manipulation and lies. Margaret had died the previous winter, alone except for the hired caregivers who found her body. Her funeral had been attended by fewer than a dozen people, a stark contrast to the elaborate social gatherings she had once hosted for hundreds of guests. James had been granted permission to attend his mother's funeral, and several people who were there reported that he had spent most of the service crying, apparently grieving not just his mother's death but the choices that had destroyed his family's relationships and reputation. The contrast between the Brooks family's ending and Alara's new beginning was stark enough to satisfy anyone's sense of justice, but Alara had discovered that revenge, even when it was justified and complete, wasn't nearly as fulfilling as creation and community. Her personal life had also transformed in ways that honored Daniel's memory while allowing her to build new relationships based on shared values rather than shared social status. 6 months earlier, she had married David Chen, Victoria's younger brother, who worked as an environmental engineer specializing in sustainable water systems. David had been helping the foundation develop irrigation and conservation systems when they had begun spending time together discussing technical challenges and long-term goals for the property. Their relationship had grown slowly and naturally, built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep compatibility that comes from working together toward common purposes. The wedding had been held at the estate, but it was completely different from the elaborate society event that had marked her marriage to Daniel. Instead of 300 guests dining under crystal chandeliers, they had celebrated with 50 friends and colleagues in the foundation's community garden, sharing a meal prepared entirely from food grown on the property. Daniel's memory had been honored throughout the celebration, with speakers acknowledging that the foundation and everything it represented existed because of his love for Alara and his determination to protect her from people who would have destroyed her potential for happiness and contribution. "Daniel would be so proud of what you've built here," Maria had said during her toast to the couple. "He protected you so you could protect others, and that's exactly what you've done." Alara and David had honeymooned by visiting sustainable agriculture projects in other countries, studying techniques and approaches that they could adapt for the foundation's programs. They had returned with plans for expanding the educational initiatives and creating international partnerships that would share their innovations with farming communities in developing nations. Their marriage represented everything Alara had learned about the difference between relationships based on social expectations and relationships based on genuine partnership. Where her marriage to Daniel had been loving but complicated by his family's hostility, her marriage to David was grounded in shared work and mutual support that made both of them stronger and more effective. The foundation's success had also attracted attention from other wealthy individuals who were interested in using their resources for community benefit rather than personal display. Alara had become an informal advisor to people who wanted to transform inherited wealth into social impact, sharing the lessons she had learned about the difference between charity that creates dependency and investment that creates opportunity. "The key is understanding that you're not giving people things," she would tell others who were considering similar transformations of their assets. "You're giving people chances to use their own talents and knowledge to build better lives. The money is just the tool that makes their work possible." These conversations had led to speaking engagements at universities and conferences where Elara shared her experience of transforming personal trauma into community healing. The shy young woman who had once needed Daniel's protection when speaking to his family was now comfortable addressing audiences of hundreds of people about sustainable agriculture, community development, and the responsibilities that come with inherited wealth. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Elara's new life was the knowledge that everything she had built would outlast her own involvement. The Foundation's programs were now embedded in the local economy and culture in ways that made them self-sustaining. Maria had trained a new generation of farmers in sustainable techniques that they were teaching to others. Roberto's water conservation systems were being manufactured by a cooperative that employed a dozen local workers. The estate itself had been placed in a permanent conservation trust that would ensure it remained a community resource regardless of what happened to any individual person. Elara had learned from the Brooks family's example that concentrating too much power in any one person's hands, even good people, was dangerous for everyone involved. On this particular morning, as she walked through the vineyards that were thriving under Maria's care, Elara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her from Daniel's bedside to this moment of contentment and purpose. The pain of losing him would never completely disappear, but it had been transformed into something that honored his memory while creating benefit for others. The rage she had felt toward his family had been channeled into determination to ensure that their pattern of exploitation couldn't be repeated against other vulnerable people. Most importantly, she had discovered that strength didn't mean the ability to defeat enemies, but the ability to create something beautiful from the wreckage that enemies left behind. That afternoon, Elara received a letter that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days following Daniel's death. It was from James Brooks, written from his small apartment where he was rebuilding his life one honest day at a time. Dear Elara, the letter began, I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you prefer not to respond to this letter. But I wanted you to know that I finally understand what my brother saw in you, and why he made the decisions he made about protecting you from our family. I spent years thinking you had somehow manipulated him, but working an honest job and living without the privileges I took for granted has taught me who was really doing the manipulating. Daniel saw what we were, and he made sure you would have everything you needed to become who you really are. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that the foundation you've built proves that Daniel's love was invested in exactly the right person. You've turned what we tried to take from you into something that helps other people, and that's a kind of strength that I'm only beginning to understand. I hope someday I can contribute something positive to the world the way you have. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Elara read the letter twice, recognizing the voice of someone who had finally learned the lessons that Daniel had tried to teach his family for years. She wouldn't respond to the letter, because some relationships couldn't be rebuilt, but she appreciated the acknowledgement that her character had been vindicated by her choices rather than her accusations. That evening, as she and David sat on the porch of the house that was now truly her home, surrounded by the sounds of a thriving agricultural community, Elara reflected on everything that had changed since Daniel's death. She had learned that love could transcend death through the choices made by people who survived loss. She had discovered that strength could be quiet and patient and still be more powerful than anger or greed. Most importantly, she had proven that the best response to people who try to destroy you isn't destroying them in return, but building something so beautiful that their destruction becomes irrelevant to your happiness. Hey everyone, thank you so much for staying with me through this incredible journey of transformation, justice, and ultimately, healing. I hope wherever you're watching this from, you're feeling inspired by Elara's story and reminded that sometimes the people who underestimate us are actually giving us the gift of low expectations that we can completely shatter. If you enjoyed this story of how a woman turned personal devastation into community transformation, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of people who refuse to let others define their worth. I love sharing stories about underdogs who become heroes, people who choose creation over destruction, and individuals who prove that real strength isn't about defeating enemies but about building something beautiful that makes their enemies irrelevant. Drop a comment below and let me know what part of Alara's journey resonated most with you. Was it her quiet strength during those months of exile? The moment she revealed her ownership at the auction? Or maybe the way she chose to use her victory to help others who had been exploited the same way she was?